As you know, I work with individuals who are developmentally or intellectually disabled, and most of my experience has been with children or adolescents on the autism spectrum. So, because it's a subject matter that I know so well and that I've had so much firsthand experience with, I thought I'd spread some awareness, and hopefully, after this speech, you'll leave a little more knowledgeable and understanding and compassionate towards these people that you come across in the community. First, I want to talk about what is the autism spectrum. And the autism spectrum encompasses three main diagnoses, which is autism, Asperger syndrome, and PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Autism, I'd say, is more of a deficit with sensory processing in general. Asperger syndrome is more of a deficit with social interaction. And PDD-NOS is sort of where they put you when you don't quite meet all the criterion for autism or Asperger syndrome, but they know you're on the spectrum somewhere. And then, of course, all three of these vary across the spectrum in so many degrees, so there's all of these places that people can fit in between, which just makes it incredibly complex. Some characterizing factors of autism spectrum disorders as a whole are social interaction, which I mentioned was mostly on the Asperger side, but of course, when you're having sensory processing issues with autism, it's just a natural consequence that social interaction will be impaired as well. But social interaction is the main focal point with a diagnosis of Asperger's. Verbal and nonverbal communication, there's abnormalities in verbal communication, or verbal communication just doesn't exist altogether. Restricted and or repetitive behavior. I could sort of compare this to an OCD ritualistic behavior, but the reasons why these individuals engage in these behaviors are totally different. With a person on the autism spectrum, they're typically engaging in this behavior because they're overstimulated and it's their only way to cope, or the only way they know how to cope. I can think of examples from my clinical experience, like someone saying a certain word or a certain phrase over and over and over again, or watching a 10-second clip of a YouTube video over again, or finding some sort of object that they like a string, and wiggling it in the air for hours on end because it helps them calm. And symptoms typically occur before the age of 3, especially with verbal and nonverbal communication. I'd say it's the most telltale sign that parents report as to how they thought that something was abnormal or amiss with their child's development. They're either not walking like they should, or they're not talking like they should, or can't tolerate tummy time, but talking is a big one, which is when they bring them to a developmental pediatrician to have them assessed. There is no known cause for autism spectrum disorders. This is incredibly controversial. There's been a lot of debate. Research suggests it is a unique interaction between genetic and environmental factors, and that causes co-occur, which means, yes, they think that there is a strong genetic component, and they think there are strong environmental factors as well. Some of these environmental factors include chemicals and hormones in our food. Some people think that gluten is a definite cause of autism, processing gluten. Some people think that vaccines cause autism. Some people think that gases and toxins in the air are linked to autism. Specifically, going back to the vaccine theory, there was a study that was published claiming that vaccines caused autism, but it shortly came out after that the statistical analyses performed in this study were falsified, which just made the whole study false, and it was completely thrown out. So none of those results that they claim to have found are considered in academia. I just want to go over some symptoms I've seen from my own personal experience working with these individuals. Neither of my parents were ever exposed to individuals with developmental disabilities. So when I sat down and tried to explain to them exactly what I did and the individuals I worked with, it was very confusing for them, and I mean, they couldn't really picture it. So it's one thing to read about it in a textbook and say, oh, it affects these certain areas, but until you see it in person, it can be a little bit difficult to grasp. I've worked with individuals who I can have extremely intelligent conversation with, who have an amazing IQ, and I can barely keep up with them. And I've also worked with individuals who have no verbal skills at all. Part of early intervention is speech and language pathology, and for some individuals it works wonders, and for some people they just unfortunately never develop those typical verbal skills that us neurotypical people have. Across the board, I find fine motor deficits and a lack of empathy or sympathy to be universals, meaning tying someone's shoes. I once taught an individual how to tie their shoes, and it took them a year to learn, but they learned eventually. And buttoning shirts, stuff like that, little stuff like that we can do without even thinking and take for granted, are extremely difficult for most people with ASDs. Lack of empathy and sympathy, that is a humongous symptom for individuals with Asperger's, but also individuals with autism as well. They can't really grasp abstract concepts, and human emotions is one of them. So to sit there and think of how someone else is feeling is just, it's completely abstract, especially when they might not even to be able to identify how they're feeling. Aggressive behaviors, including self-injury. I've worked with individuals that are aggressive towards others. I've worked with individuals that are only aggressive towards themselves. But most of the time I find that the aggression comes from being so overstimulated or not being able to communicate themselves from their lack of verbal skills that they just become so frustrated. And the only way they know how to cope is to become aggressive towards themselves or another person. And I've also worked with individuals that have no behaviors at all, that are just cool as pie. So it really is such a vast population to work with. Abnormal or extrasensory perception, especially with sound. I have worked with individuals that have to wear noise-canceling headphones. They can't go to the mall. The movies is disastrous for them. And then there are other people that absolutely love, to go to the amusement park and to go to concerts. And but extrasensory perception, which is something that can be controversial talking about it, because it's not, doesn't have much evidentiary support. I work with twin boys, and every time the full moon comes, they absolutely have the worst behaviors. They can't sleep. They're overstimulated, and I can't explain it really from a scientific perspective, but their caregivers know, their parents know that when these certain sort of cosmic changes come each year, that their symptoms will be exacerbated. Easy overstimulation, which is what I talked about before, when there's a lot of people or a lot of noise or a lot of lights or even just a lot of visual, like a lot of colors and stuff, these individuals can just become overstimulated, which can result in a behavior. I already sort of touched on the repetitive and ritualistic behavior. Like I said, they sort of find something that helps them calm, and this is incredibly unique to each individual. you cannot say that one behavior is typical in all individuals with ASD. Need for routine and structure is really another one that's solid across the board. A lot of individuals that I've worked with, and most of what I've done is try to do behavior intervention with Community Hab, is they prefer a developed schedule for their day, and they have a need for routine and structure. When their routine is thrown off, it can be like the end of the world for them. It can be devastating. They need to know what to expect. And that brings me to a sidebar point, which is presetting. In 15 minutes, we're going to go to the store. And then in 10 minutes, we're going to go to the store. And then in 5 minutes. And then in 1 minute. And that sort of creates success in their world, to be able to know what's going on in these exact increments, and to know exactly what to expect. These aren't individuals that, just go to the beach on the fly. It's something that is typically planned. So whenever there's any throws in routine, like if the fire alarm suddenly goes off, or if something is suddenly different, it can be really hard for them to cope. Unable to pick up on social cues is true across the board as well, but it's a specific hurdle for individuals on the Asperger side of the spectrum. Like I said, it's more heavily based on social cues and social interaction and social deficits, whereas the autism side is more on sensory issues, although these symptoms can just commingle with each other across the whole spectrum. And a particular ingenious skill is something I've witnessed as well. This is sort of referring to savants, which can be musicians or artists, or I worked with one young boy before. He didn't really speak much, but if you asked him what day of the week your birthday would be on in 2023, he could tell you instantly. He was a human calendar. Lack of safety awareness. This is more for individuals on the autism side of the spectrum. They don't understand that if they walk out into the street, a car might hit them, or if they get into a car with a stranger, that something bad might happen. In an emergency situation, they wouldn't understand that it's an emergency situation. And lack of value on socialization or relationships. The research does show that individuals with ASDs do end up bonding with their primary caregivers, but it's extremely hard for them to form relationships or friendships or bonds outside of that little circle. And some individuals on the autism spectrum might not even want to have any relationships with other people at all. They just don't see the value in it. They don't understand it. Think of it, especially if you can't have empathy or sympathy towards another person. Why, what would be the point in maintaining a relationship? This, I thought, was just a unique depiction of all the parts of the brain that are affected by individuals with autism spectrum disorders. If you really take this in as a whole, it really just affects the whole brain. And to think of how complex the interaction would be between genes and environment, and then on a further level, how complex it is to affect so many different parts of the brain. It's just amazing and so immense how complex this disorder is. I really just want you to go away today with ASD is a highly variable disorder. No one person fits in a box on the autism spectrum. And I hope that going forward, when you come across someone who's a little awkward or a little odd, or, I remember attending a class as a freshman, and there was a particular individual in my class who was clearly on the autism spectrum to me, but to my classmates, he was just a geek or a dweeb, or, he asked too many questions. He picked out his hand a lot, and I felt very bad for everyone involved, but especially my fellow classmates, because they were just ignorant. So I hope that you can be more compassionate in your day-to-day life with these people.